It's my pleasure this week to welcome Brad Warner, author of Letters to a Dead Friend About Zen. And Brad, just welcome to the Free Your Inner Guru podcast. I am so excited to have you here today and jump into a great big conversation about the book and also about Zen.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
So I'll share with you that I finished the book last night, and we were talking before we started this recording that my usual process is to get halfway, send the link out to schedule the interview, and then finish up. And you have written such a beautiful tribute to both Zen Buddhism and friendship.
Yeah.
And I wanted to start off by bringing that into this space where because this is very much every single chapter is a letter to a friend. It's such an intimate discussion. Why did you choose? You have other books, but this book is my first exposure to you. So why did you choose to go this route this time?
Well, it's the story is I had pitched my publishers on this book called Zen 101 that was going to be like a basic introduction to Zen philosophy and practice, because I felt like my last few books had gotten a little bit too deep sometimes, and I couldn't get through. I couldn't get the book going, and in search of inspiration, as the book says, I travel through Europe every year doing these tours where I lead retreats and things. And I also keep a little diary with me when I'm touring and just write down what's happening during the day. And a friend of mine who I didn't use his real name, but I call him Marky in the book, as you know. He died while I was on this tour of Europe in 2014. He had had cancer for about close to 3 years since his diagnosis. So I'd visited him a couple of times during his illness and spent like a week each time with him. And when I had set out on this tour, I'd been hearing bad things about how it was going. I hadn't seen him for a couple of months, and I thought, he's probably not going to make it. And sure enough, he passed away during the tour, and I got an email about that. That really threw me, and this is also in the book, but it really threw me. And I went. I was walking in Hamburg. I was in Hamburg, Germany at the time, and I sat in this pizza shop writing my diary. The thing I wrote turned out to be almost in the form of a letter to my friend who just died. And I was looking through these old diaries, and I came across that, and I thought, oh, that's what you read in the book as chapter 1 is almost verbatim from that diary entry. I changed it a little bit mainly because my editor had said, oh, this is really heavy, and he kind of asked me to maybe tone it down in some places, because I was really kind of overwhelmed at the moment that I wrote it. So I toned it down a little bit, but it's pretty much exactly what I wrote. And I just thought, when I saw that, what about just continuing that? Because it was a kind of thing like, I wish I'd told you all this stuff. Maybe it would have helped. I don't know. And I just decided to continue that for the entire book and write it as a series of letters. And I really, although it's a slightly literary conceit, I guess is the word for it, I tried to write each one just exactly as I would write it if I thought, I just sort of put myself in a position where I'm just saying, I'm just going to pretend he can read this, wherever he is. And I'm going to write it exactly as I would write it if he could read it. And then I had to kind of go back and add a few things here and there that the reader wouldn't know about, so to make it more of a complete picture. But the first drafts of every letter were exactly as I would have written to this person who passed away.
I think that's one of the reasons why it resonated so strongly with me right from the very beginning. And one was the way that grief, even if it was toned down, the way that it resonated as true.
Yeah,
And
well, it was real.
it was,
I mean, yeah.
and I received it as that. And I lost my best childhood friend
Oh,
when we were both 38.
oh, whoa.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so that I literally read 2 pages and then I brought it with us on a trip to Europe. And
Wow.
yeah, because
So
I was
you
like,
read it in Europe, and it's all written as if it's written in Europe.
absolutely.
So that's kind of funny.
Absolutely. So, and then there was something that you wrote on page 4 that I'm gonna just read to you. I have it here in my notes,
Okay.
and this is literally you had me on at page 4,
All
and
right.
it's
I'm
not that's
curious to
not to
know
do
what
with
it
the
is.
friend. That's not the friend. That's jumping right into
Hmm.
really my wheelhouse, which is what most people call spirituality is bullshit. And here I have dedicated my life to something most people call spiritual practices.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it sometimes. I wasn't, I didn't get into Zen Buddhism because I wanted to be Mr. Spiritual Zen guy. There are people who do that, and I think that's okay. But that wasn't the case for me. I was really kind of cynical about religion and spirituality in general, and I'd been trying for a few years before I discovered Zen to find some sort of a spiritual path, and it's kind of weird because I was a teenager, but I was this kind of like cranky, sullen teenager, and everything I encountered was just so I just couldn't buy it. And the Zen thing got me because it was really, really honest, like super honest. And when the Zen teachers don't know, they go, I don't know. Which was so refreshing to hear, because I'd been hearing from so many people who said they knew things that I thought nobody knows that. So that's kind of how I feel. And and also, writing to this particular friend, to the Marky in the book, I he was like me. He was like me, but he didn't never found anything. So he was sort of inclined to ponder the bigger questions of life, but nothing had ever, there was no path for him. And I think there's a lot of people like that. And I don't know. That's so I would think that somebody like him would think, oh, what an idiot, going out to temples and meditating all day. But and I would think, what an idiot, going out to temples and meditating all day, if I hadn't done it. So that's where that comes from.
And at what point did you decide to make this, as you said, I'll just use your own words because I don't want to put any other labels on it. At what point did you decide to make that the focus of your life, or to dedicate your life to it?
What point? It's hard to say, because I started in the early 80s and I was in my late teens, or maybe I was 20 by the time I started. And I found the Zazen practice to be really, really useful, and I liked the way it made life feel a little bit more manageable. But um, I was sort of not sold on the spirituality of it, or the dedicating my life to it. I just did Zazen every day. I just sat and did it. And a few times during that period, I gave up on it, going, well, I did that for a while. I guess I'm done with it. And every time I stopped doing Zazen, I just felt worse. All the sort of noise and fizz in my head just came back, and I went, I better do the Zazen again, and I just start doing it again. And I guess I don't know if I ever said, I'm going to commit my life to this. It was more like I looked at my own past and went, gosh, I've committed my life to this, you know, and this is what I do now. I do it full time now, which I never would have expected. I didn't set off to be a monk, or I wanted to be a writer for a long time, but I sort of imagined myself as writing science fiction or something. I didn't, or maybe getting into screenwriting or something like that. Was sort of my dream. Writing about Zen was sort of an afterthought. I had two different Zen teachers, and they both sort of encouraged me to write a book about Zen. And I thought they were both crazy because I thought this, I'm not a book about Zen writer guy. But I
Mhm.
did it, and the first book became Hardcore Zen in 2004, and it wasn't it wasn't a blockbuster hit, but it was bigger than anybody expected it to be. It was a long time before I could make a career out of it, and I always had to have a regular job. But at this point, it's what I do now, so
And
it's weird.
it's funny. It is. And I had a client session this morning, and we were talking
Mm,
about how we don't necessarily get to choose what our life becomes about.
that's for
It
sure, yeah.
it can be highly influenced by events in our lives. And
Well, yeah, it sure is. I mean, that's the way I feel about it. And I sort of, in my own case, I sort of feel like I've accepted this rather than, jumping into it full force. I've accepted maybe this is what I'm meant to do. I don't know. But everything else sort of didn't work out, and this did, um, in a fashion, I suppose. So yeah, I don't think we get to choose. I don't think we get to choose even who we are or how we're perceived in the world. You just kind of figure it out and deal with it. That's been my experience.
just before we start going into any, because I definitely want for the listener to understand what Zazen is. And just while we're talking a little bit about how you got to that path
Hmm.
through your teens and 20s, which are the years that you, I guess, knew Marky the
Hmm.
best, it was all in front of this backdrop called punk rock.
Yeah. Yeah. It that's what we bonded on in the Wadsworth High School in those days. There weren't many people who were into punk rock. It was kind of a rural Ohio sort of school. And I think all of us who were into that stuff knew each other. So we were, part of this little clique of punk rockers. And then after high school, I still kept in contact because we both had bands and we were playing shows together. And I ended up, we shared a house for a while, one of these punk rock houses where both of our bands practiced in the basement. And yeah, so all of that was going on. And I didn't make a thing about my Zen practice to those people. I kind of hid it. I was slightly embarrassed about it because it's not a very punk thing to do to meditate every day, uh, and also I didn't want to be one of those guys who are trying to push their religion on you and saying you should meditate, because what do I know about what people should do? But so I'm not sure if the real Marky knew that I did this practice until my first book came out. I'm actually not. I don't
Mm.
remember it coming up in any conversation or anything before then, but it might have, because he did have a band that had Zen in their name. So I don't know if that was because he knew I was doing that stuff, or just thought it sounded funny. I don't really know.
And and is that hang on, I'll edit this part out. I was just going to ask about that. It's okay. Um, so you do after reading the book, I'm still
Mhm.
not completely clear. Do you this we'll get into Zen Buddhism
Sure.
and some of the practices. Do you view Zen Buddhism as a religion, or do you view it as a lifestyle? You make
Yeah.
some distinctions.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and people in the world of Zen kind of are split on this one, and I usually come down on the side of it's not a religion. There are other people, including some people I have a great respect and admiration for, who say it is a religion and can make a case for it being a religion that I can't really disagree with. But that it's still, I don't think it's a religion in the way most people think of a religion, because for one thing, it's not a belief system. I mean, there are certain beliefs that you might find common among a lot of Zen Buddhists, but there's no insistence in the teaching and philosophy that you must believe those things. They just sort of, they're just sort of things that kind of seem to be commonly held among a lot of us, and so there's no God in the traditional, in the Judeo-Christian Islamic sense of God. There's no creator figure, but I have another book called There Is No God and He Is Always With You, in which I kind of argue that calling Zen a form of atheism, which some people do, isn't quite correct either. I think there is a certain sense of something that's like what some people call God. It sounds very weird. There isn't this materialistic atheism, is what I guess what I mean. And the materialistic atheism is sort of the atheism that says everything is matter and atoms interacting with each other, and there's absolutely no place for anything else in that scheme. There's no spirit, there's no God, there's no nothing. Zen doesn't take that stance, or at least most Zen philosophers don't take that stance. There is some sort of spiritual aspect to the world we live in, the universe we live in, and there's even an aspect which you could call God, but it's not God in the sense of a guy sitting on a throne. So in the sense of not having a God like that, and the sense of not having a belief system, that's where I say it's not a religion, but there are also aspects of it that do look like a religion. So.
And what are some of those? Is that ceremony,
Mhm.
practices, gathering?
Yeah, all of that. So, if you go to a standard Zen temple, they'll do usually a service which involves some chanting and offering incense, and there's a statue of a Buddha in the middle of the room, and people do certain ritual things to that. Not There are some Zen Buddhists who even reject that. My own two teachers did very little of that. They did just a tiny bit. I do a little bit more than either of my teachers, just because of the groups that I work with. I feel like it's good for them to have a bit of exposure to the ceremonies. But so there's that. There are temples, and usually associate that with religions. And there are orders of Buddhists who wear robes and do those things. So that's also like a religion. But in my opinion, I feel like it's more a sense of people finding what works in religion and incorporating that into the practice that we do, rather than doing it in the same way as religions usually do. Because like the things that you chant, for example, in a Zen Buddhist service, they're not translated into English, but if you find the English translations, or some places they do them in English, and read what they're saying, they're not worshipful things. They're actually like philosophical. They're almost like something that could have come from Nietzsche or somebody like that you chant in almost the way that a Catholic church, they would sing a hymn, but what we're singing is philosophy.
So, and that's my point of reference. I was raised Catholic, and so came up through going to church on Sundays and that kind of ritual and ceremony. And then as I went on my own, I'll call it personal development journey, that's when I got reintroduced to the idea of other religions and other movements and the value they might have instead of the one singular look.
Yeah.
So as far as the big sort of 3 or 4 religions, let's because you are a Zen Buddhist, let's stay there. Okay. Where would you, in that world, I love this podcast is as much about my privilege to be able to sit here and talk and learn from you.
That's fine, yeah.
But also present the conversation, right?
Yeah,
and so
that's great.
So within the world of Zen Buddhism, where would you orient the Zen Buddhism relative, say, to Tibetan Buddhism or other sects, just so that when we narrow down into what the practices are, it makes sense in the landscape?
Right. Yeah, it's another good question. Zen is a kind of a funny thing among the other Buddhisms. And in fact, there's a book that came out a few years, I don't know, 20 years ago or something, called the Shambhala Dictionary of Buddhism and Zen. And I feel like the title of that book tells you a lot about how other Buddhists view Zen, because the people who put that book together were not Zen Buddhists. So they call it Buddhism and Zen, as if Zen is, something, we sort of, yeah, those guys are kind of like us. It's in a sense, it's the mystical tradition within Buddhism, although all of Buddhism has a bit of that mysticism to it. But like in the Catholic tradition, there's for example, the Carmelite order of nuns is kind of a good example of the mystical tradition in contemporary Catholicism. And in the past, Catholicism had a lot more of that, and it sort of kind of disappeared. But I often find a lot more, if I'm reading Christian mystics, sometimes I feel like they sound more like Zen Buddhists than other forms of Buddhism sound like Zen Buddhists. And also if I read stuff from the Kabbalah or the Sufi tradition, it's the same thing. I feel like it feels more like one of those things. So it's sort of that outlier mystical tradition. But it does have the distinction in that, as far as I know, and maybe there's an example of this that I'm missing, but as far as I know, it's the only example of a religion where the mystical tradition for a brief time became the popular tradition. And that would be in China about 1,000 years ago. But it blossomed as being the most popular form of Buddhism was this mystical Zen tradition they called Chan. And that lasted for, I don't know how long, a few decades, probably not much longer than that. And then kind of went back to being, the place it had always been, the outlier place. But that was the time that Dogen went to China, and he's the guy that brought that sort of Buddhism to Japan, and then it caught on in Japan too as the popular version of Buddhism a little bit later. So that's interesting. But I think right now it's probably, it's no longer. It's the one form of Buddhism you'll hear more people referencing, especially in North America, than any other. But it's I don't think the most popular of the traditions. Even in North America, you'll find a lot more Tibetan Buddhism and other things if you just count the number of people. Although when I tried to look up the statistics for that, I found out nobody's done them yet. It's just my eyeballs looking around and seeing what's there that makes me think the Zen form is still a kind of a minor one.
And is the North American version of Zen Buddhism, is it consistent or loyal to the Japanese or Chinese, or has it been transformed or transmutated?
This is a good question too. Sorry, I keep saying that's a good question. But it is, I think it is mostly, there's a whole lot I could say about that, but let's see if I can get more basic. The reason, the way Zen came to the United States was, well, first through D.T. Suzuki, who was an academic and writer and wrote a lot of books about it, but wasn't necessarily, I don't think he was ever ordained or anything. He might have been, but he was much more of an academic than a practitioner, I believe. The other Suzuki who came over was a guy named Shunryu Suzuki, who founded the San Francisco Zen Center. And by weird circumstances, he happened to show up in San Francisco at the time that a lot of the beatniks who lived in San Francisco were reading D.T. Suzuki's books about Zen. So these guys found out that there was a Zen temple in their own town, but that Zen temple was really mainly built and continuing its existence to serve the Japanese community, to be kind of just more of a gathering place for the Japanese community who were into that sort of thing. But Shunryu Suzuki happened to be sent over to be the head of this, and he was a guy who was real serious about the practice. So the Japanese people that he was ministering to were mostly there for the ceremonies and services, but along come these non-Japanese people who were like, we want to meditate. So what he introduced them to is I would say the more pure form of Zen. So it's the form of Zen that's really focused on the meditation practice, and that's what came up. Whereas in Japan, that style of Zen is kind of, I wouldn't say it's completely gone, because I did have a teacher who taught that style, but it's so rare. It's really rare. My Japanese Zen teacher used to say that most Zen priests in Japan were just glorified funeral directors, because that's kind of how they operate. The funeral business is how they make their money, and a lot of them go into it as a kind of a family business. Dad was the local Zen priest, and his dad was the local Zen priest, and then it just got passed down. It's starting to pass down to daughters nowadays. In the last 40 or 50 years, that's become more of a thing, but it's just passed down through the family, and because of that, unfortunately, most of the people who get the job of being a Zen priest, the local Zen priest, they're not that committed to it. They're just kind of doing it because that's what the family business is. But there are still a few people who do it. So it's a roundabout answer to your question. So I think that in some ways, the tradition as it is in North America and Europe and a lot of other places is authentic to the Japanese tradition, but it's authentic to an older form of the Japanese tradition. It's not really authentic to the current contemporary form of the Japanese tradition.
And also, just it absolutely does. And just to make it make sense for someone who's hearing only, or even who's eventually seeing a video of this on YouTube, you're American.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you're American, but you got your Zen training in Japan.
I got it both in the US and Japan. So yeah.
Okay.
So I had a teacher, I had an American teacher who himself had a Japanese teacher in Ohio when I was living there and was a university student and all that. Then I moved to Japan really to take a teaching job because I needed a job, and I wasn't really planning on doing a sort of Zen thing in Japan. But while I was over there, I met this teacher who initially I didn't like him, but that's a whole other story. But eventually I learned to really like and respect him. And he was the one who wanted me to ordain. So yeah, I lived in Japan for 11 years, and I continued working for a Japanese company for about 5 years, even after I came back to the US. So I was over there a lot. I just travel back and forth for work all the time. So that's, if you count that time, I spent a lot of time in Japan. So my sense of what Zen is sort of mixed with my sense of what I experienced in Japan too. So that kind of it kind of gives me an interesting outlook on the whole thing,
Oh shoot. Oh, as an aside, the story of that moment where you made up your mind to like your teacher is in the book, and it was a standout for me. So no need to retell it now, because I don't want the book to be an aside to this. It is so good. I really do want people listening to get it and read it. But it's very poignant, and it's very, I think, indicative of your sense of either right and wrong or truth and not truth within the Buddhist, system, and was enlightening in its own way. So let's talk about meditation and the role of meditation within Zen, and relative to other types of Buddhism, and we'll just bring the conversation over to sort of North American meditation trends. And but you used the word Zazen earlier, so can you explain to us what that is, and how it might differ from how people are either trying to meditate, being taught to meditate, or I'll just hand it right over to you.
Yeah, I spend my life explaining Zazen to people, but every time I get asked to do it again, I'm like, oh, how can I do this? So let me try it. It's I used to not like to use the word meditation when I'd refer to Zazen, but I found out that I was confusing people when I didn't. So now I'll call it a type of meditation. But I feel like in a superficial sense, it certainly looks like pretty much every other form of meditation, is that you're sitting very still, you're sitting upright on a cushion, and your back is not supported, and you're trying to keep straight, and you're trying to stay still. Your eyes are open, which makes it different from other forms of meditation in one of the superficial ways, but mostly it looks like meditation. I think the difference between Zazen and the forms of meditation that I'm most familiar with is that there's no goal to it. You're not trying to become mindful, you're not trying to become enlightened, you're not trying to become a better person, whatever goal you have in mind for your Zen practice, is you're usually told to just forget about that. Just sit for the sake of sitting itself. Don't even try to make your mind blank, but you do sort of try to allow thoughts to pass away naturally. So if a thought comes up, you're trying not to hold on to it, or to have this little conversations with yourself like we all do. So you're trying to
Yeah,
avoid that,
the one
but you're
that
not.
goes, the conversation that goes, oh, this is bullshit.
Yeah, yeah.
Bullshit. Bullshit,
that's
bullshit, bullshit.
well, you can
I
have
suck
that
at this. This
conversation.
is bullshit.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people have that conversation, and a lot of people give up on it. But the thing is, it doesn't matter whether you feel like it's going well or not. The instruction is usually don't even judge it. And if you find yourself judging it, don't judge yourself for judging it. Just stay still, and keep up with it. And when you first start a practice like that, it's really difficult, because I'm just talking about myself here, I always wanted to put some kind of goal in there, because I thought, oh, I'm just lost, I don't know what I'm doing. And the point of it is to have that experience of not judging at all, of just being lost. You're just like, I don't know whether this is good or bad. That's the point. You don't even have to know whether it's good meditation or bad meditation, you just do it. So that's the biggest difference. And we usually generally sit for, the standard period is between 20 and 40 minutes. People can, my first teacher had this nice saying, which is, he said, you should do Zazen every day, even if it's for 5 lousy minutes, which I liked. So you can do it short, or you can do it long, but you're sitting there, and I think it would probably seem to any rational person that would be a pointless activity. And in a way, it is a pointless activity. That's the point of the activity, is to be pointless, ironically enough. But in that pointless activity, you kind of gradually start to come to the source of all activity, because you start to realize that everything is pointless. Everything I do, and not in a nasty sort of negative way, but in the way that I'm just doing this right now, and whatever results come out of doing this right now, that's something else, and that may or may not happen, but I'm just doing this right now. And to me, the best analog in sort of things normal people do is as exercise. If you were obsessing during your exercise about how many inches you're going to put on your forearms, or how much weight you're going to lose, or whatever people obsess about, you might never get the exercising done, or you get too depressed to do it because it's not happening fast enough, or whatever. So that's the same sort of approach we take. We're just not worried about it. And ironically, good things do happen if you meditate, if you do Zazen. And but the tradition in the Zen stream is not to focus on that too much. It's to just kind of say, just sit.
So at the risk of putting a point on it,
Yeah.
is it about not being attached to it?
Well, in a way, yeah. That I think I put it. I know I put it in one of my books, and I think it's in the Letters to a Dead Friend. But I learned recently, and you'd think I would have learned this a long time ago, that the Sanskrit word that's usually translated as attachment actually has a secondary meaning, or a not even secondary. It has a double meaning, and the other meaning of it is fuel. And certain scholars have put forward the idea that we probably should not have translated as an attachment, all those years ago. It probably should have been translated as fuel all along. And so what that means is, when you're meditating, you're not adding fuel to whatever processes are going on in your brain. So if you're having a, you know, experience like, I hate this, you don't add more fuel to it. Or if you're having the experience of, I love this, I'm doing this so well, you don't add more fuel to that either. So you just try to avoid adding anything to what's already going on in the practice.
That's really cool. Thanks for that. So why eyes open?
A lot of people ask that.
Yeah, I'm like you're a Westerner. I came
Yeah.
to meditation through the self-help world, which I want to talk to you about later in the conversation. But in my frame of reference, it's always been eyes closed. And since starting the book, I thought, wow, open my eyes. Radically
Yeah.
different experience.
It is, and the thing for me is, since Zazen was the first sort of meditation I ever did, I haven't really meditated with eyes closed. But my teacher, the first teacher, the American guy who first taught me, he used to explain it by saying that we keep our eyes open as a way of acknowledging the outside world. Like, the outside world is still part of our practice, and we're not trying to get into, you know, close our eyes and get into an inner sort of head space or an inner space. We're trying to find that balance so that the outside world is involved in our practice, but we turn and face a wall. so you're looking at something boring. You know, I used to like to say it's literally watching paint dry. You know, you're just sitting there watching, you know, this wall. And most people who do Zazen, we tend to kind of, you know, half close our eyes. But my teacher in Japan didn't even like that. He said, your eyes should be completely open. But I tend to let my eyelids droop a little.
I can hear the herds of people running to go and sit to watch the paint dry right now, Brad.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's a tough sell.
But you also share that your teacher said that, I'm paraphrasing and I don't have it right in front of me in my notes, but about anytime you're wandering, check your posture.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was his main criteria for practice. And he would say, if your mind is wandering, check your posture. And when I first heard that, I thought, well, that's goofy advice, because I'd had another teacher, and I don't think he would have disagreed with that, but that isn't the way he said it. So when I heard this check your posture thing, I thought, well, you know. But when I started doing that, and this is, you know, when I first got to Japan in the early 90s, I started practicing with him. I've never found a time where my mind was wandering during Zazen and my posture was still good. There was the body tends to follow the mind, you know. So if you're thinking a lot, your shoulders are going up, you know, and if you're getting a little lazy, sometimes you're just, you know, you're losing your balance that way. But there's always something that's going on where the mind is starting to carry the body in a certain direction. So I found it's really useful. So if your mind is wandering, look at what your posture is doing. And that won't necessarily, it doesn't just blow all the thoughts out of your mind when you check your posture, but it does change a lot of it. Usually I find out that the thoughts I'm having immediately before adjusting my posture, those go away. You know, another group of them might emerge right after, but the ones I'm obsessing about when I fix my posture, they kind of scatter for the, you know, shelter or wherever they go.
I run into this. I meditate. I recommend to people who I meet to meditate in some kind of strange way. I've become a huge advocate of meditation. And in the book, there's a quote. This isn't you, I'll clarify. This is from, I think it's a book, Zigzag Zen, because I want to
Oh,
address
yeah,
the so-called busy Western mind, because I thought that was very
yeah.
poignant. So I'm going to read it to you. And it says, because I hear a lot of that. So I'm leveraging you right now.
Okay.
So it's clear that many of us Westerners have such hypersensitive minds and complex psychological dynamics that it's very difficult to quiet and discipline our minds enough to make any real progress along the meditative path.
Yeah, I didn't say that. It's it came from that book Zigzag Zen, and I thought it was a great example of how people will tell themselves that they are specially, not good at meditating. And the thing is, if it was an easy thing to do to meditate, they wouldn't build big statues to people who meditated. It's not, it's understood that this is not an easy thing to do, and it's never been an easy thing to do. And there's a certain sort of, I hate to even go there, but there's a certain sort of subtle racism to that
Oh, go
to that
there.
comment,
You're
because
welcome.
he's sort of saying that his Western mind is all complex and dynamic, but those Asians over there, they must, they must have these simple minds that are not like that. And that's, I lived in Japan for long enough to know that's not true. Everybody's got complex minds that are going all over the place. So that's just the human condition wherever you go. And it's just hard, especially when you first start. And that idea of progress, that this is one of the things I think is sort of genius about the Zen tradition, is that they say forget about progress. Even if you feel like you're doing the most garbage Zen that's ever been done, that's still Zazen. That's still perfectly valid Zazen, even if your mind is bubbling over with ideas and that thing that guy said to you 2 years ago, or whatever, whatever happens to be. It's fine. That's just how it goes sometimes, and other times it goes better. And I've been doing it for 35 years or so now, and it still goes like that. Some days are really good and some days just aren't. And but I do it anyway, so. And I have, after doing it for this long, I have more good days than bad days, whereas in the old times I have more bad days than good days. But I still get times where it's just like, it's still just like, when I'm sitting there on the cushion, instead of being anything beautiful and meditative the way you imagine, or people imagine.
I'm in full on empathy, but not in the realm of meditation. I'm thinking about when I run. I
Oh
used to
yeah.
run long distance, and I'm a crap runner. I am like the slowest of the slow of the slow, and yet somehow, completed half a dozen half marathons. And
Oh, that's
even my
great.
worst run was better than the run that I didn't take.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. It's kind of funny you mentioned running, because that's the thing that got my teacher in Japan. He was in the track team when he was in high school, and he used to like to tell the story that one of the reasons he got into Zen is because he did it. I don't know what possessed him to take his first sesshin or whatever he went on in the first place, but when he did it, he felt like there was something in the practice that he'd only felt before when running. This kind of way that sometimes the mind just kind of clears out, and you're just into the pure experience of it. And he said that the Zen practice was the he always related it to that. And he was always really excited when anybody from an athletic background would show up at class. It used to kind of annoy me sometimes how excited he'd get. But there was one time we did a sesshin, and a tennis pro, I don't even remember where he's from, but he's probably somebody that you'd know if you're into tennis, but I can't remember the guy's name. Anyway, he showed up at this retreat, and Nishijima Roshi was so excited to have the tennis pro there, because it was somebody he could talk to about the connection between that athletic stuff and the Zen practice.
Like the training, and trust your training,
Yeah.
right? Like when it comes down to that day when you're going out there to take the measured run, it's like you got to trust your training.
Yeah,
I bet
you
there's a
gotta.
bridge there too. It's
I think so. If I was more athletic, I could probably make a better case for it. In my own case, though, being I don't know if you call a bass player for a punk rock band a musician, but being some sort of musician, that's something I also noticed. There's something in the Zen practice that I'd only experienced before when playing music, specifically playing music on a stage with a group. It very rarely seems to happen, at least for me, in private rehearsals. But if I'm up there with a group and we're all focused on getting that, getting the music right, uh, it, thinking has to go you know, if you think too much, you just lose your place, and you don't know what you're playing anymore. So you have to kind of just get into the purity of the experience if you want it to happen. And when it happens well, when everybody locks in together, there's this sort of magic that happens that's I think I heard Frank Zappa talk about it one time, and of course his music is way more complex than anything I ever played. But he talked about that as being, you know, something really special. And I said, yeah, that, you know, even playing simple music like punk rock, it can happen too. Because punk rock, even though it's simple, it has to be played pretty precisely for it to work, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing about that.
I'm going to make sure that my son listens to this interview. He's a guitarist
uh,
and I don't even know how to quantify the level of alternative rock he plays,
there's
but
so many forms these days.
and it's harsh. It's
Yeah.
and I apologize, Cameron, if I just called it harsh, but it's very, very fast, and he's amazing. And watching him play, it's just, that is something that I could never access with my mind and hands. Like, it is
Yeah.
another state.
It is something. I mean, you'd probably call Zero Defex, the band I'm in, harsh too, because we're probably more old school than your son's band. But that was the sort of idea, was to play as fast as possible, you know, and just kind of, you know, mow the audience down with this, you know, this sound.
The wall of sound.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. So we've talked a lot about meditation, and I know that is I guess the defining characteristic of Zen Buddhism, but it sits in the larger set of practices called Buddhism. I'd love to talk a little bit about the Four Noble Truths, or the Eightfold Path, just to bring them in here, because one of the things that you made me think about and I don't know if I'll remember the letter, I'll scroll through here, but it's, you know, things tend to become popular, and then they get extracted from the very environment that made them what they are. And so you've got meditation / mindfulness overrunning everything, or highly popularized. And we all come to it in our own way. Like I shared earlier, I never heard of meditating really, other than this strange thing that Catholics didn't do, until I was going to personal development workshops. So that was my context. So I was in I think the mostly extracted context. So what's your opinion on that? What are your thoughts on that? And should we be looking at it in isolation, or should we be exploring more? Or could we be exploring more?
I have kind of strong opinions on it, which I've expressed a few times in public before. But I don't hate the mindfulness movement. I think it's probably better that it's there than when it wasn't there. I think it's mostly a good thing. But the problem is, you mentioned the Eightfold Path, and I can never remember all eightfolds of the path. But in one of the Buddha's first talks that he ever gave publicly, he mentions this thing called the Noble Eightfold Paths, and I can't remember which number it is, but mindfulness is one of those. So there's I can't remember all of them, but right. So
I want to laugh because I went to write them down. I wrote down 7 of them. So if I feed you 7, you might get number 8.
Yeah, no, it's right action.
Let's try.
Okay, go ahead.
Right view, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration.
God, what is the missing one? I don't know.
Okay, you talk, I'm gonna look.
Yeah, it's funny, but that, you know, when you extract mindfulness from that, you get something. Okay, one of the big issues that you'll hear Zen Buddhists talk about all the time is ethics, and how important ethics are to the Buddhist path, and how important it is to lead an ethical life. And that's kind of drummed into you. You do a ceremony called Jukai, in which you agree to abide by the 10 Buddhist precepts, which are kind of similar in some ways to the 10 commandments. You know, a lot of them are the same. You know, don't kill, don't steal are in there. Don't be covetous is in there. So a lot of them are quite similar. But it's the bottom line is it's all about being ethical. And I think a lot of that gets lost. And also the one of the reasons that the Zen stream developed in the way it did with those rituals and things that we talked about earlier is because and this is my reading of it, but my understanding of the development of this practice is that the Buddha had a particular, he did this sort of meditation where he just kind of threw out everything. You know, he'd learned to meditate from several other teachers, but he kind of threw out everything that he'd learned and just tried to kind of get into the pure experience of meditation for its own sake. And then he had some great revelation, which is, you know, always written about in very flowery terms, and maybe it wasn't quite as, you know, as flowery as we hear about it, but he did have some kind of turning point. And then he decided to try to teach that to others. And as he went along teaching it to various kinds of people in various places all around the northern part of India, he found different problems came up. And each time a problem would come up, he'd try to find a way to adjust the system so that it fit the problem. And that same process has been going on for 2,000 years now, which means that there's a lot of sort of research and development going into this thing. What happens when you try to take the mindfulness out of that is you end up throwing away all that research and development. And I think I understand the reason a lot of people do that is because they want to present something secular. And in Western society, we really have this strong value about things being secular because, you know, our own history is filled with bad things happening when people got too religious, you know, the Crusades and all this stuff, witch burnings and things like that. And I think that cultural history has made us very sensitive, or made a lot of us very sensitive to just trying to find something that's purely secular. And so in an effort to make a purely secularized version of Buddhism, which only has mindfulness, they throw out all the things that look religious, but then you've thrown out all this support that's been, you know, discovered through the centuries that makes the meditation kind of work, that makes a foundation for it. You know, if you went to a mindfulness course and somebody asked you to take a public vow to uphold an ethical system, you know, people would be like, what? You know, they'd back off and run away. But I think there's a good reason to do that, especially if you're a meditator, because meditation has certain pitfalls that other practices don't, and one of them is you have to do it for years before this happens, but you start to learn your own psychology very well, and you start to understand that your own psychology is really, there's very little difference between, you know, your psychology and somebody else's, which means that if you want to, you can become a master manipulator of people. And I think that there's been some scandals that have happened in the world of Buddhism in the West. And when I look at some of those, I think, oh, that's a guy who discovered the master manipulation aspect and kind of went a little crazy with it and ended up harming a lot of people. You know, it often becomes like a sexual thing, you know, and so that's a, you know, people who discover they have this ability to manipulate people become very, you know, it's like it's better than, what was that book that was out that was telling you how to get sex really easy? It was a really popular book a few years ago. The Game, I think it was called.
Okay, yeah.
You know, it's better than that. And so that's why you need the ethical stuff, you know. So that's one of the reasons you're always drummed into your mind that you need to be ethical, because you can find a certain power from this practice that can be misused. And yeah, I mean, it's not, for most people that's not a big danger, but it's enough of a problem that we have this ethical system. And besides that, the ethical system also comes out of a philosophical understanding that there really isn't a separation between people. I mean, oneness, when you're first presented with it, sounds like, oh, that's a nice idea up there in the sky, oneness. But after you work with it for a while, you find that oneness is going on everywhere in every situation. You know, every time you're with somebody, you're leaking into them and they're leaking into you, and to do harm to somebody else is essentially equivalent to doing harm to yourself. And so if you're intelligent, you won't do that, but not a lot of us are that intelligent, so we do it all the time.
I'm just noting the time.
Okay.
My listeners will be going nuts when they hear you talking about this.
Oh no.
This part, the way I'm going to tell you this is probably not going to be in it, but we'll decide if we go there, because this is a part of the territory that I'm going into.
Okay.
Ever hear of the Sweat Lodge in Sedona, where at a self-help event 3 people died?
I did hear about that. In fact, I think I met a guy he wasn't there at the time, but he was part of that same organization, and he was telling me some of the details about it. Were you there?
I was there.
Oh my God. Yeah.
I was there. This is the new territory.
Wow.
Wow. And you're serving it up to me. Oh, what a week.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you something. You gave me a confidential earlier. This will be confidential.
Okay.
Well, I just spent all of Monday being interviewed for a massive, massive, massive podcast that's being made about it to be released next year.
Wow. Oh, well, that's interesting.
2 weeks ago, I just got flown to California to be on a television interview that's going to be released early next year.
It's good that it's coming out, because I don't remember the details that this guy told me, but I remember being kind of surprised. I'm like, oh, it was like that, because wasn't exactly how I sort of pictured it going down. But you were there. I don't think he was even there. He just knew some of the people somehow.
Yeah, it's there's, so in this sidebar of ours, and there's some debate even still, especially in my mind. It's clear that year wasn't like the others. Mm-hmm. So, however, there had been problems in the past.
Yeah.
So, shit.
Sorry for laughing. This is my go-to response, is to giggle. So some people take offense at it, but it doesn't mean I'm not taking you seriously.
No, I know. That's all good. There's every emotion and every reaction to it under the sun. Okay. So you were just talking about using it to manipulate and being in sort of that space of oneness. And I'm sitting there going, wow, how interesting. Because that's what's being explored now.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to leave it hanging for now, but I didn't want to bring it up as a shock and surprise, because I do want to talk to you about where Buddhism and all of this sits in the self-help landscape. And then I'll come. Okay. If it feels right, I'll go in there. Otherwise, I'll get some people would be upset and just be like, why didn't you? You had someone there who you could have talked to about it, and that's what you're here to do. Yeah. So, but I never wanted to be a surprise. I was going to bring it up, except for the fact that I was late for my own call. So, so yeah. So, so if somebody is listening to this and they're meditating and it's been prescribed to them, even as a practice, say from a Western practitioner. Yeah. I mean, Western practitioners are having people do mindfulness exercises. Are you saying that it's less potentially powerful without these principles, or are you saying that it's all lonely out there without the things it was made with?
Maybe more like the second. It's well, often, and this comes from reading a little bit about what's going on out there in the world, but often there are these people who are recommending mindfulness in the context of a psychiatric relationship or whatever, who themselves don't really know that much about meditation. So in the Zen stream, you don't get to be a teacher of Zen. It usually takes years of practice before a teacher will say to somebody, okay, now you have my permission to go out there and teach on your own. And part of that is, I can't say that either of my teachers ever specifically made note of this, but I think part of the process that any teacher is going to look for is whether you've had some of the darker experiences around meditation, and if you've had the darker experiences around meditation and gotten through them and come out the other side okay, then you might be ready to teach it. So what happens often is the psychiatrists and professionals in those areas will look upon meditation as just something that makes you feel good. It calms you down. It lowers your heart rate and lowers your, I don't know, adrenaline, whatever. There's all sorts of research around. I don't really know, but it does do those things initially. But for a lot of people, I think for anybody who meditates seriously for long enough, they're going to encounter their own darkness. We all have it. And when it comes up, it can often, if you're not ready for it, nobody's ever completely ready for it, it can be a shock. And I'm just speaking for my own self now. But when it came up for me, and some of the things that like when you're quieting your mind and not putting a lot of new thoughts into it, what tends to happen is a lot of old repressed stuff will start to reemerge. Things you hadn't thought about in years or decades, things maybe you'd never thought about, but that happened to you. Those things will start to appear, and you'll find things about yourself that you don't like. I mean, that's my own experience. Like I found that there was elements within my personality that I had previously believed only occurred in the personalities of the worst people in the world. Whoever you have in mind as the worst person in the world, whether it's Hitler or whoever, you think that they're uniquely bad, and that's what happened there, is that was just a uniquely bad person. And then you practice for yourself and then find out, oh my God, that's in me. And that can be a shocker. And if your teacher hasn't had that experience, your teacher isn't going to know what to do with it usually, and that's what's happening. A lot of the complaints that are coming along with the current mindfulness movement have to do with people who say, well, I got into mindfulness-based stress reduction to reduce my stress, and then I found out I was 10 times more stressed. That happens to a fair amount of people. And if the teachers who are dealing with it don't know about that, then they're not going to know how to deal with it. I've gone through it, and sometimes when somebody presents it to me, like it's happening, I do these one-on-ones with students all the time, and sometimes somebody will come in with something, and every person has a different specific version of it that's kind of characteristic of them, but it's all kind of the same thing, really, when you get down to it. But they'll present me their personal specific version of it, and I'm going, oh my God. But I have to be, that's what I'm doing inside, but I'm trying to go, oh yes, well, but I have to talk them through it and say, well, yeah, that's, you're just experiencing something that we all have, but most of us repress so thoroughly that it's not just that we think we don't have it, we think we're completely incapable of having thoughts like that. And then you have a thought like that you thought you were incapable of having, and you go, oh my God, and I know it happened to me, and I had to go and have these meetings with my teachers and go, oh my God, I'm thinking about it. And they go, oh.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And even just having that, I would imagine that in that moment, just having somebody receive it as, you're not a bad person, you're not evil for having these thoughts, you're not unique in your darkness, just like you're not unique in your lightness.
Yeah, it's really good. And that's I think about the specific things my teachers said to me in those moments, and probably if you'd recorded them and played them back, they would sound like nothing, you know, they would be like,
Hmm.
whoa, whoa. But when you actually have somebody go, that's okay, you know, you just don't respond to that thought and don't give it any more fuel than you've already given it, and let it go, and eventually it'll go away. And that was also hard for me to believe, because I'd been told that, and then I'm going, well, it's not going away, it's been 3 weeks. You know, I'm going, it takes longer than 3 weeks. But eventually, if you stop feeding into it, it just goes, and then you're like, I don't have that anymore. And that's really beautiful, but that takes, you know, some work to get to.
Mm. It almost, I hate using this word, but I'm going to anyways. It almost sounds like, that seeing your ego, seeing
Mm-hmm.
that narcissistic side, or that all the less attractive, or we want to think less authentic,
Mm-hmm.
um, versions of ourselves.
Yeah, that's all in there, and you're doing a good job if you're keeping that stuff in check, you know, and that's great. So but the fact that it's in there in and of itself is really not that big of a deal. But that's one of the reasons we want to handle the meditation stuff carefully, because I've, you know, some of the other worse scandals that have happened where, you know, something terrible happens in a meditation group. You know, I'm thinking of like Om Shinrikyo in Japan. I was actually in Japan when that happened. I don't know if you know, you or your listeners might not know about that, because I don't know if it was as big of a deal, but this guy named Shoko Asahara put poison gas on the Tokyo subway systems in an attempt to start, you know, an apocalypse, and several people were killed, and like hundreds were severely injured in that. And I was in Tokyo that day riding the trains, but the trains I was riding on were a different line, so I was lucky. But he was a meditation coach, you know, and guru, and or something that he presented himself as, and a lot of people had come to him because they wanted to find, you know, this way to meditate. But he himself had rejected having a teacher, you know. So
Mm-hmm.
so when those sort of psychotic things happened, I don't think he ever had anybody to tell him that you don't
Hey, not
need to
cool,
go
buddy.
there. Yeah, yeah.
Not all thoughts need to turn into action.
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
especially the one that says kill a bunch of people on the Tokyo subway system.
Um,
You kind of don't want to put that one in action.
no. So I want to. I'm torn in two different directions here. I think I'll stay on this thread. Then I'm going to come back around to the mindfulness and self help.
Mhm,
But carrying along with this, taking mindfulness and meditation out of Buddhist tradition, and then there's a chapter later on in the book that I found very interesting, and it's called "Are Drugs the Gateway to Zen?"
mhm,
And I had an experience with somebody who, I've never done ayahuasca. I've done a lot of things. In
mhm,
fact, this person called me when she was considering going to do ayahuasca, because
mhm,
publicly I've been outed as having been a part of some pretty hardcore, spiritual events. And so she was asking me, had I done ayahuasca, would I do ayahuasca? And then she went and had her ayahuasca experience.
mhm,
So, and then what happened afterwards was not cool. Um,
mhm.
so talk share with us your perspective on that, because it brought, this is another thing that's been popularized.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really concerned about it, because it's been a resurgence, you know. One of the things that what I loved about the punk scene that I was part of was there's the straight edge movement, where you just didn't do drugs or drink or anything. And then to see this sort of come back is kind of upsetting. I took acid before I was into Zen, and I took it because I'd read Be Here Now, and I wanted to have a spiritual experience with, you know, on LSD, and didn't really have one. But it's, I think the problem with those things isn't so much that it's an inauthentic spiritual experience, because in some ways it might be, but using those kind of drugs and things will push you into something usually way sooner than you're ready for it. So you might have an authentic spiritual experience, but if you're not ready for that experience, then there's nothing you can do with it. It just becomes more fuel for the ego, and it can actually be damaging. So one of the things I love about Zen is that it's so boring, but you have to go through this, years of boredom before you have any experiences. And in fact, in the Soto tradition that I come from, it's considered a little bit bad. I can't think of the right word. It's considered like not very useful to talk about some of the more special experiences that one can have around Zen practice, but they do happen. But they usually happen after years and years of struggle and boredom and dark times and stuff that that's not so fun. But they happen, and they can penetrate very deeply. And that's the trouble I see. And the whole ayahuasca thing, it's often presented as, this is the ancient shamanic tradition, and I'm going, well, yeah, it is in South America for people who lived in a jungle all their lives and have been steeped in the philosophy and traditions that surround the experience of ayahuasca. That's an essential part of what makes it work. And if you didn't grow up in that community, in that environment, and then you take that substance, I don't think it's even possible to have the same sort of experience. But you'll have some kind of experience, and that experience can be, like I say, it can be really damaging. I mean, sometimes it can be really beautiful, but it's sort of like, imagine you putting the coin in and rolling the slot machine. You don't know what you're going to get when you put it in your mouth. I mean, that's what my fourth LSD trip was, so bad that I don't even like to think about it. And that's when I gave up the whole thing. But the first three had been lovely, and I expected it to be lovely again. And then it was the most horrible night of my life,
And I'm gonna you compare it in the same chapter to the difference between the mountain climber versus the helicopter guy.
Right.
Right? Like the helicopter guy flies up to the top of the mountain, takes a look around, and then sees what he, in this case, so he or she needs to see and experience the glory of it, and then they fly back down. But the mountain climber
has done it. Yeah, has made the climb, and that makes a huge difference in the experience. And it's not just that the mountain climber isn't just after the view from the summit of the mountain. That's something that a lot of people don't understand when they make these comparisons, because
like incremental.
Each increment is part of the whole experience, and that's how we deal with it in the Zen practice. Each moment is still part of that overall experience. So it's not just the spectacular moment of unsurpassed perfect enlightenment, as they say in the literature. It's everything else leading up to that, and everything else that comes after.
I feel like there's I'll share with the listeners who know who've been with me for a while. We timed out earlier in the conversation because I was like, Brad, you've just kind of served up to me a talk about my experience in my spiritual journey, where as a matter of speaking, a similar shortcut was taken.
Yeah.
And it was the Sedona Sweat Lodge.
Yeah.
And
that must have been something. Sorry.
we would need a few episodes time to talk about, to even try to explain it. But you go in, I often refer to it, and this is as neutral, talk about neutralizing something, but like peak of expectations, pit of experience. Right? Like rebirth and transformation, celebration is the expectation, and tragic loss of 3 lives plus. And we're in that territory because this was a native tradition taken out of the context of the native way
Hmm.
And at the time, the last thing on my mind was cultural appropriation
Yeah.
or shortcut, because how really? It just never would have occurred to me.
Yeah.
It occurs to me now about how potentially, dangerous these kind of things can be, even if no one comes to
Yeah.
physical harm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something something I sometimes I feel like I spend too much time talking about it, but I feel like a lot of the people promoting meditation don't spend any time talking about it. So, maybe that makes me go overboard a little bit. But there are some potential dangers. Now, if you handle it right and if you have a good teacher, you'll get through that, and it doesn't really become such a big deal. But it is important. This is why we have Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. That's the three treasures is what they're called. So Sangha is the group, and I always sort of hated that one because I'm not a real people person, and I don't like hanging out with people and things like that. But it's important to have that sort of community around it, because then you have people, you can have a teacher who's at a certain level of doing it, but then it's also nice to have some other people who are at various points in their meditative career, and to just kind of be around. It doesn't even mean you have to always talk about your meditation experiences with everybody, but you just have that that there's people around you who've kind of got a little bit of a handle on what's going on. And yeah, it's too bad. I'm not a fan of that term cultural appropriation, but there's a real thing around that.
Oh
But
yeah,
it
because
does,
you
but
do
it
address
is,
that though,
yeah, but it
because
is
everything comes.
applicable. Yeah, but it is applicable in this case, where you just take the thing out of the culture and try to put it into another cultural context where it doesn't really have the support system that it had in the other place that it comes from. And and it's a bit like playing with fire, and I think a lot of us don't realize how heavy some of these things we're dealing with are, especially when it's promoted as it's stress reduction, and you go, okay, it's going to be stress reduction, and for a lot of people it's not stress reduction, and you got to kind of feel your way through that as well.
When ugh, again, I'll need to edit out. I always go a little bit wonky after talking about it.
Yeah.
Um, the I know what I want to do. So you have a chapter in there called "Crazy Wisdom is usually more crazy than wise."
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's there was a guy who's kind of famous, Chogyam Trungpa. I don't think he coined the term for crazy wisdom, but he kind of became very heavily associated with it. And he was active in he was Tibetan, but he was active in the U.S. for years. And I think he did a lot of good for a lot of people, but there were a lot of people who had a very different experience with him. And crazy wisdom is this idea that wisdom doesn't always look the way you expect it to. So Trungpa, I think it's not telling any secrets that he was a heavy drinker, and he also had some sexual things that he liked to do that were a bit unusual. um, and he never hid any of that. All of his followers knew that that's the kind of person he was. Uh, and so he was trying to kind of ride that wave, and trying to be a good teacher and still not give up those aspects of him, his personality. uh, but a lot of times that gets translated wrongly into this idea that we can just do whatever we want. And even for Trungpa, he died when he was 48 years old. So I don't think it was that good for him, and I don't think he maybe had quite as much of a grip on it as he may have thought he did, or that wouldn't have happened. But yeah, so I am a bit. That stuff seems very exciting, and probably the reason that I put that into this particular book is because I'm addressing it to the specific person, to Marky, who I talk about, and he was in his black leather jacket and goth and in a punk rock band, and he was a drinker, and so I kind of feel like that people like that are often attracted to that, like, oh, look, you can, this is a, a different way to do it. uh, but it can easily become kind of an excuse just to be, kind of a jerk.
um, and and you were in the in that same vein, you were saying that these kind of situations are why we need to know what the principles are, so that we can
Yeah.
discern what's crazy wisdom, or what's not wisdom. Maybe I won't put a label on the crazy wisdom, because crazy
Yeah.
wisdom could also be stuff that isn't logical,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
non-linear, or woo. If we go up to, you have you refer to woo woo in your
Yeah.
writing, and so at the core of it, there seems to be like, we're human. Just don't follow blindly.
Yeah, that's kind of it, and you just have to be careful. And you're right, crazy is kind of a funny word, and it's a little bit of a dirty word for some people. And there are aspects even in Dogen, who's a very sober sort of teacher, that sound pretty wild when you get into some of his philosophical ideas. Um, and some of the koan stories, we didn't even touch on those, but those are the stories in Zen that just sound weird, for most people, and end up with a guy twisting another guy's nose or something, as a way of teaching. So, so there's all sides to it, and it's just kind of an admonition to tread carefully in that area.
So where do you see, like, coming back to the book, where do you see this going for you? You've got the book out. You're doing retreats. I was on your YouTube channel last night, taking a look around, and I also couldn't help but notice that you have a podcast.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
can
I
you
just
tell
started
us?
the podcast. Well, the podcast is something I just started doing because I realized the concept of letters to a dead friend about Zen was potentially infinite. There's no reason I have to stop with the letters that I wrote in the book. So I've continued writing them, as much for myself as for the audience, and I'm continuing to share them with audiences who want to hear them. And then we have a little discussion about it. So that's what the podcast is. I've put 2 episodes up so far. I have 4 more in the can, and I'm going to be recording another one in a couple weeks. So that I'm really excited about, and trying to continue with. And I'm still traveling around doing the retreats and everything, and I've just written, I don't want to talk too much about it, but I've just written a first draft of a proposal for another book that's going to be a completely other direction from this one. So I think this is an interesting path to be on, and I'm glad that I came across it. So there are occasions when I sort of curse my teachers for sticking me with this thing, because I'm kind of stuck as a meditator and a Zen person for the rest of my life, and I can't get out of it. But on the other hand, it's a good place to be, and I think it's a way to get into some things about life that I couldn't have gotten into any other way. At least I couldn't have, personally. And so I'm just going to keep writing books and doing stuff.
Well, and I think it also gives you a perspective, a vantage point, and a voice that, well, your voice is yours no matter what, but your vantage point is to me, it's unique,
Oh,
which is saying something, because I've been steeped in this stuff for over 10 years now.
mm,
And and I think there's a lot of things in the book, but also listening to you in the brief bits of YouTube, that I was taking a look into. I was like, here's a smart guy who is not afraid to speak his mind.
well, thanks. I try. I think I'm on kind of the outs with most of the North American Buddhist community because I kind of don't go along with everything that they want to go along with. But I gotta try to do this honestly, and I never do anything with the intention of being, harming anybody or upsetting anybody. But it sometimes works out that way, and then I always feel a little bad that I upset them. Um, but but I think it's important to kind of get it all out there, and I'm just trying to keep doing that.
And then let people make up their own minds, but they
Yeah.
can't make up their own mind if they aren't given everything to look at.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I think if people kind of look at what I do and reject it, well, that's good. At least they looked, and maybe they know why they rejected it. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
That's wonderful. Well, listen, I know you've got to go. I feel like we could do a whole other one back to back. So thank you for coming
Yeah.
in and being willing to explore different areas, and I will give links to your site and to the books in the show notes. But just
Okay.
for anyone who is just listening right now and can't click on
Mhm.
anything, where's the best place for people to find you online?
Yeah, my blog is hardcorezen.info, and because we couldn't get .com or .net, so it's hardcorezen.info, because Hardcore Zen was the name of my first book. And if you go to hardcorezen.info, there is links to, well, there's a blog there, it's right there, and there's links to how to buy the book, and to all the other things I'm doing, where I'm going to be speaking. So it's all there, and the podcast is linked to it, so you can find it all there.
Okay, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure
Yeah.
meeting you and speaking with you, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, this is great. This is actually, honestly, one of the best interviews I've done. So anytime you want to have me back on, I'm perfectly happy to come on.
I'm going to take you up on that statement. My pleasure, Brad.
Thanks.